All right. Part 3. We're at part 3 of the literature survey, and this is the one where we hopefully finish antiquity. We can do, and maybe hit the early Christians. You might not be here for that bit if you're leaving in a half hour, but
yeah,
you can always get it on the rewatch. The early Christian bit has some slight relevance to Kirk Cameron's Christmas.
Good old Saint Nicholas beating a man to death with a stick. Always
Yeah,
fantastic.
I don't know if he was to death, but yeah, knocked him on the ground anyway with his stick. That was so badly filmed too, wasn't it?
Yeah, because Kirk Cameron is a hack.
Don't insult hacks like that.
Yeah, he's a special kind of hack. We'll leave it at that, since we might go on a tangent.
Yeah, pardon me if I disappear briefly now and then. I have to run and get things sometimes. So let me see. A few things from last time that I need to quickly finish up.
Alrighty. I will listen and provide commentary as needed.
Excellent. So, Plato. A couple of things I wanted to say about Plato really quickly. Let's see. One is Plato had this notion about love, where you ascend from human love to the divine, but then when you reach the higher rungs, you leave the lower ones behind. So the original object, I'm quoting from C.S. Lewis's Allegory of Love, the original object has simply fallen out of sight before the soul arrives at the spiritual object. So that's another little thing to add to Plato. And there was one other thing about Plato in here. I'm pretty sure. Let me just see it. Sorry. Yes. Symbolism. Basically, the idea that everything in this material world is kind of like a copy of something in a better world. This visible world is but a picture of the invisible. That's not quoted from Plato, but it's the same general idea. So it's not exactly allegory. Ovid. I said something last time about his art of love, so let me just quote one or two bits. Where supposedly the lover, they're teaching you how to be a proper lover of a lady. Go early ere the appointed hour to meet the fair and long await her in the street. Through shouldering clouds on all her errands run, though graver business wait the while undone. This must be an 18th century translation or something. But the whole thing is kind of a joke, because in reality, he would probably have sent the women out of the room before any serious conversation came along. So it's not really. He's contrasting it with courtly love as known in the Middle Ages. What else? There was something here about. There was something about. Oh, there were a few quotes from Seneca, and then I can ask you a question really quickly. Let's see. So, Seneca. Okay, it has to do with the whole idea of like this battle between your soul between good and bad, because you don't find that in Aristotle or Plato. In Plato, the idea is the reason people are bad is they don't know, and as soon as you remove their ignorance, they'll become good. because
I disagree with that heartily.
yeah, yeah, I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not.
I am firmly of the opinion that as soon as people gain more knowledge, they become worse in many cases, because they find out how they can abuse other people.
Well, I mean, it depends on their conscience, but knowledge in itself will not make them better.
Yeah. It really depends, like, if it's knowledge of how to, like, hurt other people, and they're so inclined, that will just make it worse, usually.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not as simple as you become. I mean, that's what you find in the dialogues. Like Socrates, if he talks to people and reasons with them enough, they'll come to understand. Like the whole argument where some chap at the beginning of the Republic says, justice is the interest of the stronger. And then Socrates carries on and eventually tears that to bits, and then eventually devises his theory of the spiritual forms, whereof the real world or of the material world is a copy. And eventually he also comes up with his political thing, which we mentioned last time about guardians and all that rot. So yeah. But with but later on under Seneca, under the Roman Empire, you've got something different coming up. You got the idea of a battlefield where the virtues and vices are fighting it out. And Seneca will say things like, the pleasures are to be fought down. I'm actually quoting from what it says. That's what it says.
I know. I imagine he did, but that go are felt down is kind of kind of has a different connotation.
No comment. No comment. We must watch more carefully than the soldiers in an ordinary war, for if once we let the enemy, pleasure, slip through, she will drag a host of other enemies after her. Blah, 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 and so forth. We are engaged in a lawsuit which must be pursued without moderation and without end, for our adversary is also endless and immoderate. They are lying in wait for us to strangle us like the thieves in Egypt, our appetites, etc. But then he also calls life a journey, so it's not just a matter of war. Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, Seneca was a bit of a hypocrite anyway. So if you were going to compare the Romans to the Greeks in literature, what impression would you have?
Romans are less original than the Greeks?
Yeah. Pretty much.
They're mostly Romans are basically rip-off artists in a lot of ways.
Yeah, pretty much. Which is interesting in terms of mythology, because the mythology, in Greece, the mythology arose organically, and then scholars in Alexandria and in Egypt, because you know that Greece eventually ceased to be a bunch of free city-states, more or less free anyway, and became some large empires. One of them was centered around Egypt. And there was a famous library in Alexandria. But what was I? I was going somewhere with that. The scholars there gathered these things together, and then it was passed on to the Romans, and it kind of became, in the Romans, it's kind of like decoration, almost. No, maybe not decoration exactly, but this brings us to allegory. Where is this bit? Because you've got the Romans worshipping personifications like patience, victory, hope, and so forth. And then in the later, like, I'm not sure when Statius was. I think he was the late 1st century AD. then the gods start becoming kind of like personifications, whereas the personifications become more, because they're personifications of virtues, they become more, um, they become more, they become worshipped, in a sense, they become worshipped more than are the actual gods, because with more devotion, more fervently, people speak of them more fervently than the actual gods. And all this stuff I'm getting from C.S. Lewis's Allegory of Love. Let's see. For example, Mars is home, where Mars just hangs around raging all the time. In in mythology, Mars does a lot more than just rage. He has that affair with. He fights on the side of the Trojans. He has that affair with Aphrodite, or Venus, whatever. But in this, he just hangs out and rages, basically. So the gods aren't very interesting.
So they're very much caricatures of their original selves.
Yeah, they're kind of like in that and decoration. Whereas something like mercy, an altar amidst the city rose, which none of all the mightier gods can claim. Mild mercy's seat, hallowed continually by suppliant sorrow, never thence repulsed. To ask is to obtain. So that's a lot deeper than here he beheld Mars home, the leafless woods, etc., etc., etc. So anyway, all that stuff I'm getting from Lewis's Allegory of Love. And what else was I going to? I was going to say something about. One other thing I need to mention quickly is. Sorry, I'm grabbing my book here. The other thing I need to mention here is the so-called second sophistic, where basically, because rhetoric was originally designed for deliberation, right? But under the Roman Empire, it's kind of a totalitarian state. You don't have that anymore. So rhetoric becomes mainly about declaiming and making fancy speeches and showing off and all that. So I needed to briefly mention that, because it also kind of affects style in writing sometimes too. And let me also say a little something. Before we leave the Romans altogether, let me say a little something about Marcianus Capella. Oh, you know what? I don't have my I'm sorry, I don't have my PowerPoint. Well, it's not really PowerPoint, but you know what I mean. I don't have my presentation up. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, it just helps people follow what's going on. So let me. Okay, and luckily with Opera it's pretty easy to share screen. Yeah. Let's see. See that? Okay, good. Oh, let me get rid of that rubbish. Let me get rid of that rubbish on the side. There. How's that?
Yeah, looks good.
Whoops, it went all black on me all of a sudden. Is it black for you too?
Yes.
Why the blazes would it be black? All right. I spoke too soon about opera being relatively good, I guess. Okay. Share screen. Yeah, let me see if it works better this time. Okay. Okay, good. So basically, there were 9 liberal arts. Then there were 7 liberal arts. There was the trivium, like at the end of the Roman period. There was the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium is dialectic, rhetoric, and grammar. Actually, I should put grammar first. Grammar, rhetoric, dialectic. So those had to do with words. And then the quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, not architecture. Wait, I'm sorry. Arithmetic. Oh, astronomy. Arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music. So a chap named Marcianus Capella writes a work entitled The Marriage of Philology and Mercury, where he's got this whole big allegorical frame story to explain these things. So this will give you an idea of how people wrote in those days. So this might be mildly amusing or not, depending. Let's see. But yes. And this bit I'm getting from Rhetoric in the Middle Ages. So here, but while the crowd of gods terrestrial was thus disconcerted, I don't know why they were disconcerted, but anyway, were thus disconcerted, behold, a woman of loftiest stature and great assurance, with countenance of radiant splendor, made her solemn entry. Helmeted and crowned with royal majesty, she held ready for defense or attack weapons that gleamed with the flash of lightning. Beneath her armor, the vesture draped Roman-wise about her shoulders, glittered with various light of all figurae, all schemata. These are rhetoric, terms of rhetoric. And she was cinctured, like belted, I think, with precious colors for jewels. The clatter of weapons as she moved was as if thunder and the crash of a cloud of flame broke with leaping echoes. Nay, it seemed as if, like Jove, she herself could hurl the thunderbolt. For as a queen in control of all things, she has shown the power to move men whither she pleased, or whence, to bow them to tears, to incite them to rage, to transform the Mayan unfeeling as well of cities as of embattled armies and all the hosts of people. So that's philology for you.
Very eloquent.
Yes, very. And that's how people wrote back then. That's not even that bad.
I'm not a big fan of purple prose, but it's definitely better than a lot of the purple prose we're getting nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, people were trained properly back then.
That is true. They're not like crazies like Joshua David Bellin.
Oh. Okay. Is he the monster chap? Is that chap?
Yeah, he's the Framing Monsters chap.
Yeah. All right.
He's the guy who says that Jurassic Park is about the patriarchy asserting its control over monstrous women.
Oh, that's it. I haven't actually watched Jurassic Park, but that's certainly interesting.
Basically, just because all of the dinosaurs are female due to the fact that they wanted to keep the dinosaurs from breeding, and females are generally more docile than men, or at least that females are than males.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the species. Female spiders are not very docile.
That is true. I guess it's like they're kind of going with like like female frogs, since the dinosaurs are basically mutated frogs.
Yeah, mutated frogs. Yeah, so that's interesting. That's how they wrote back then. And let's see, half a moment, because I have to go get my lunch in a second.
Okay.
I have to go get my lunch in a moment, and then I can talk a little bit about the early Christian era. Because I should really cover that before the fall of Rome, even though I mean, it's a pity you'll miss the bit about after Rome, because it's sort of interesting what happens after Rome. I can summarize really quickly what's going to happen after Rome, which is that because the one of the purposes of education in under the Roman Empire was to enter the bureaucracy. Now that bureaucracy doesn't exist anymore after the fall of Rome. The bureaucracy is relatively simple, and that's not. And the main way you get promoted is by being a warrior. So you don't really need education if you're a member of the laity. So that's why, as I understand it, that's why education becomes largely limited to the church in the West, whereas in the East, you still have the empire for a little while, for a few centuries. Well, depending on your point of view, for a few centuries or for several centuries. But
I'd say several, since the Byzantine Empire was around for a really, really long time, and they managed to keep the glories of Rome somewhat intact for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, they never really recovered after the 13th century. But even making allowance for that 13th century, it's still several centuries.
Well, I think, wasn't it like they were destroyed around the 13th century by the Turks?
Not by the Turks, but by the Latins, by the Norman, by the Crusaders, the Fourth Crusade, a kind of a shameful moment in our history.
Yeah, essentially, it's like, well, first they were like they were like raided by a bunch of Crusaders, and then they got completely destroyed by the Turks.
Yeah, I mean, they recovered a little bit in the mid 13th century, but then, pardon me, I'm eating, but then they finally succumbed altogether in the 15th century.
Mm-hmm.
But they were already like really weak before. They never really recovered from the 13th century, from the Fourth Crusade.
Yeah, it was not a very good time.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, I mean, lots of other things were good, which I'll talk about when we get that period. But politically, most periods are bad.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And maybe it's a blessing in disguise that Rome fell, because the system didn't work very well in terms of, because it tended to lend it. There was no fixed system of succession, so there was constant risk of civil wars and murders and assassinations, and it was kind of totalitarian as well. So,
Yeah.
Maybe it's not entirely bad that Rome fell.
No, we did lose a lot of technology and a lot of information that made life easier, and our technology went backward a really far amount. But yeah, it's the government of Rome was exceptionally corrupt. It was like, I think there was one of my Roman history professors in what was it, during the Roman period, said that it wasn't a matter of rooting out corruption, it's just making sure that your corruption was stylish.
Yeah, I mean, corruption was considered normal. Basically, if you had a position, it was expected you would help out your friends. In terms of technology and that, there is some advance in the Middle Ages, but I think it's more like, most of it's more in the later Middle Ages or middle Middle Ages. Like, there's stuff going on, like glasses in the 13th century. I might talk about that I'll talk about that a bit in a later lecture. But socially things were a lot. Society became a lot. Society became dominated by Germanic norms. However, this is all getting ahead of ourselves, because I did want to say something about the early Christian period. Pardon me a moment. I need to go and get something.
Go for it.
Say something amusing.
Unfortunately, I do have to get going. My friend is here. I'm sorry. Okay. I'll catch this on the rewind.
What, just say you have to make a run for it now?
Yeah, unfortunately. So, see you later, buddy.
Okay, have a riot. And hello in the chat. Hello. Pardon me. I'll be coming and going a bit now and then because I'm getting things. Also because I'm eating. Let's see. Half a moment. Let me see if I can. Hello there in the chat. Let me see if I can do this. Oh yeah, it worked. Good. That's nice and easy. The invasion of the Venetians and others was a precipitation of decline. Yeah, there was a certain amount of, they were in debt to like the Venetians and the Genoese too. So part of it was like a financial problem. So the Italians were kind of economically dominant there already by the 13th century. And in fact, the Venetians were involved in the Fourth Crusade, so. So let me see. I wanted to say something about the early Christian period, just to quickly go over it. I'm not going to say much about the New Testament because I mean that's readily available. Greek was the main language for quite a while. So we have Saint Clement, Saint Irenaeus, Saint Ignatius. Saint Irenaeus, what I mainly remember about him is that he wrote against the Gnostics. In fact, what I mainly remember about the early Christian era in general is there was a lot of there's always, in fact, church history in general, there's always been a lot of debate about various about doctrine. The Gnostics, I can make that off now. We've already had that on. The Gnostics, and I may be mischaracterizing them, they seem to have basically had an idea that that the material world was bad, so they needed to keep the actual God pure from it. And they did it in various ways by having a genealogy of other gods intermediary between the creator, the actual, so that God wouldn't actually be responsible directly for the material world, or something along those lines. There was something else about the Gnostics. What was it? Oh dear. Something else about the Gnostics I was going to mention. Well, if it comes back to me, I'll mention it. And there's and then in the 4th century, there's the Aryan Controversy, which has to do with pardon me, one moment. Which has to do with whether Jesus Christ is equal to God the Father, or if he's actually just a creation. Oh, come on. One moment. More technical difficulties. Okay, let me get back in here. So that's what we were talking about earlier with the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea laid down that the God the Son is equal to God the Father. And then the first Council of Constantinople added that the Holy Spirit is also equal to the Son and the Father. So these were the issues that were being debated in the 4th century. There are others, but I'll talk about them a little bit later when I talk about St. Augustine. And I'll quickly mention a few others. St. Basil, monastic founder. There was also the original founder of monasticism was St. Anthony in Egypt. St. Basil, St. John Chrysostom, who I mainly remember as being an eloquent speaker. Origen, slightly heterodox. I think he may have believed in reincarnation or something along those lines. He also taught that eventually even Satan would be converted and would repent. St. Clement of Alexandria, and so forth. And then there's a period afterwards, covering this bit really quickly, with Christological debates about the nature of Christ. Does he have one nature? Does he have two natures? Does he have a human nature and a divine nature, or what? And there was a lot of it went on. Those debates went on for quite some time. They went on from like the 4th or 5th century. I think more like the 5th century to the 7th. There was a debate on iconoclasm. Basically, is iconoclasm idolatry? Is revering icons okay, or is it idolatry? And Eventually, it was accepted that you could revere icons because you can use because matter has been sanctified by the incarnation. If any of that makes any sense. Pardon me. And as long as I'm talking about the, half a second, let me check. And let me, as long as I'm talking about the Greeks, let me blaze through the Byzantines and who they consider to be the great authors. Photius, Photius. He's the one who, he was involved in a controversy over the procession of the Holy Spirit. Does he proceed from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son? And this became a big sticking point between East and West, but at this point it was not yet a big sticking point between East and West. It only became one in the course of the 11th century. Michael Psellos, historian. Anna Komnena, 11th century. I think Michael Psellos was also 11th century. Anna Komnena is 11th century. She was the sister of the emperor, and she wrote an account of, including information about the First Crusade. St. Gregory Palamas, I shouldn't have said invented hesychasm. Hesychasm, Hesych, pardon me, ASM. And let me quickly look up, let me quickly get my book and check up on that really briefly. That's from the 14th century, so that's after the split with Rome. Pardon me. Palamas. Let me see. I'm just checking this up really quickly. 70. Okay, the hesychasts. Okay. The main problem, how to confirm both that man knows God and that God is unknowable. And he answers, we know God by his energy, is not his essence, that is, by the effects of what he's done and not in his inner nature. So that's hesychasm. That's the 5-second explanation of hesychasm. Okay, so, let me just make sure that my screen looks right. Yes, good. Okay. What? Now it's gone. Okay. Pardon the occasional momentary silence. I sometimes have to step away momentarily. Okay. The Latin fathers. I'm actually going to go to St. Augustine um, after I mention these other ones because I have to talk about him a little longer. Um, Tertullian, I think Tertullian was third century. Was third century AD. Let me quickly double check and see. I think he was third century AD. He was. Let's see. Tertullian. I'm pretty sure it was third century. He was kind of, like I say, he was kind of an extremist. He would say things, he was for like completely rejecting all pagan culture. What has Jerusalem to do with Athens? He would say, was fond of saying things like, credo quia impossibile. I believe it because it is impossible. So in other words, he took a kind of an anti-rational approach to it. And eventually I think he joined a heresy called the Montanists, who taught that marriage was bad. I don't know what the exact connection, if they were connected to the Gnostics or not. Anyway, Saint Jerome, he translated the Bible into Latin, and he was involved in polemic a lot, and I'll talk about some of the polemics when we get to St. Augustine. St. Ambrose also wrote polemic. He wrote hymns. He was the Archbishop of Milan. He at one point excommunicated the emperor, and I can't remember exactly why. I wonder if I can find that in here somewhere. Okay, good. You can see it. Good. Let me check a couple of things really quickly. I want to check Tertullian dates as long as I'm checking something anyway. Tertullian was born in the mid 2nd century AD and died in 220 AD. So that's Tertullian. And let me quickly check a bit about Ambrose. Excommunicated the Emperor Theodosius. Okay, here we go. Apparently the reason had to do with the massacre of Thessalonica, where a Roman official was murdered in an urban riot, and the details are not very clear, but anyway, that apparently was why St. Ambrose communicated him. Let me see. So, yep, that's why. It was because of that's why, according to Wikipedia anyway, that was why. So, Let me get back into my spreadsheet. Oh dear, Prudentius. Half a moment. Sorry about that. Prudentius. I want to see a teeny tiny bit about Prudentius. He has an important role in that he wrote a poem that was completely allegorical. And so far as I know, there are no fully allegorical works before then. This is before Martianus Capella. I mentioned Martianus Capella earlier, but he's 5th century. Prudentius is like 4th century. I'm not sure if he lived into the 5th century or not. So most of my information about the psychomachia comes from C.S. Lewis's allegory of love, and C.S. Lewis is not an admirer of this poem at all. Let's see, have a moment. Let's see. He says, he comments of it that the mountains travailed and a mouse was born. It's just, and he goes on to say it's a symptom rather than a source. Let's see. Yeah, he says the reason why it fails is that he's not really is that Prudentius is not really an epic poet. That's one reason why it fails. The other is that using an epic battle is using a pitched battle as an allegory for the conflict between virtues and vices he calls it, only the crudest allegory will represent it by a pitched battle. The abstractions owe their life to the inner conflict, but once they have come to life, the poet must fetch a compass and dispose his fiction more artfully. And he thinks that a journey is a better analogy to life than a combat in a closed field. So, and he gives some examples of this. There's a meeting between pride and humility. So, needless to say, humility wins. It wins mainly because pride just falls head over heels into a pitfall, which her own ally fraud had dug shortly before. So now humility must triumph and yet remain humble. So he can only explain that she triumphs modestly, uplifts her face with moderated cheer, and civil looks tempering her joy. and it doesn't really work very well. But anyway, the importance for us lies primarily in that it's the first or one of the first fully allegorical works. So let me quickly check there. Let's see. So St. Augustine. St. Augustine is the dominant figure in it's like one of the dominant figures in the history of Western Christianity. So we have to spend some time on him because of all the authors of that time, he's the one who speaks most clearly to because there's a certain timelessness about his writing, about the themes he treats and the way he treats them. For example, but first I need to do a quick biography. Have a moment. St. Augustine was born in North Africa town of Hippo. Actually, wait. No, he was born in Tagaste in the middle of the 4th century. He died in the year 430. So he lived to see the sack of Rome. He didn't see the complete fall of the Roman Empire, but he managed to. But he was still alive when the Vandals were conquering North Africa. And North Africa was very much part of the civilized Greco-Roman world. at this time. I think both his parents were Christians, but his father was only, his mother was much more engaged with Christianity than his father was. And he went and had an education. The education was still kind of, even though Christianity had already triumphed, in a manner of speaking, in the empire, it was still, the educational system was still kind of dominated by paganism. And there was a lot going on besides just Christianity. There was Manichaeism, which taught an absolute duality between light and darkness, matter and spirit. A little like Gnosticism, but more developed. Manichaeism lasted for several centuries after, primarily in Central Asia. It lasted for several centuries. It was still going strong in the early Middle Ages. I'm not sure when it finally fell to Islam. But at this point in time, it was very... So anyway, he became a Manichae for a while. Then he left the Manichaees, which is... It's interesting why he left them. Because one reason why he left them was he thought their science was bad. Their astronomy was incorrect, or at least was incorrect according to the standards of that time. So he left the Manichaees. He became, for a while there, he followed, I think he followed Neoplatonism for a while. He was in the academy for a while. Let me see where that bit. He's helped. In fact, this is interesting. The books of the Platonists help him to understand the problem of evil. He realizes that evil is a perversion of the will, not a substance, as the Manichaees claim. And yes, this was the era of so yeah. So initially, when he becomes converted to Christianity, one of the factors is, in fact, the fact that the translator of Plotinus into Latin, Victorinus, Victorinus, becomes converted to Christianity, and then he goes and reads the story of he goes and eventually he converts to Christianity. And a lot of this information may be found in his confessions. Let me quote a few bits from his confession, because this is the most accessible of his works to the modern reader. You can enjoy it, even if I think you ought to be able to enjoy it reasonably well, even if you're not a Christian. Let me see. I want to come to the beginning and end bits. He says, because the whole thing is a prayer to God, right? So he says, Magnus es Domine et laudabilis valde, magna virtus tua et sapientiae tuae non est numerus, which you are a great Lord and truly praiseworthy. Great is your power, and of your wisdom there is no measure. So that's how the book begins. And it ends. Let me get to the ending bit. And then there are a couple of other bits I want to quote from really quickly. Okay. Okay, okay, the ending bit is a little too long. So let me skip over that, and I wanted to check the bits where there's a bit where he's a teenager and he and his friends rob a pear tree. And I'm going to translate this bit into English, if I can find it. Let's see. It is certain, O Lord, that theft is punished by your law, the law that is written in men's hearts and cannot be erased, no matter how sinful they are, etc., etc., etc. Yet I was willing to steal, and steal I did, although I was not compelled by any lack, unless it were the lack of a sense of justice or a distaste for what was right and a greedy love of doing wrong. For of what I stole I already had plenty, and much better at that. And I had no wish to enjoy the things I coveted by stealing, but only to enjoy the theft itself and the sin. ... Perhaps we ate some of them, but our real pleasure consisted in doing something that was forbidden. So, and then there's another bit I want to read a little bit of. His friend Alypius, who went through a period when he was addicted to the gladiatorial games, and you know that those were blood sports. Not to find a point on it. So his friends were going to drag Alypius to force him to attend. So he says, "You may drag me there bodily, but do you imagine that you can make me watch the show and give my mind to it? I shall be there, but it will be just as if I were not present, and I shall prove myself stronger than you or the games." So, but then ... But then he becomes curious because he closes his eyes, but he's still listening, and an incident in the fight drew a great roar from the crowd, and this thrilled him so deeply that he could not contain his curiosity. Whatever caused the uproar, he was confident that, if he saw it, he would find it repulsive and remain master of himself. So he opened his eyes, and his soul was stabbed with a wound more deadly than any which the gladiator, whom he was so anxious to see, had received in his body. Pardon me. He fell, and fell more pitifully than the man whose fall had drawn that roar of excitement from the crowd. And he only later did he become freed from this bloodlust, through a lot of prayer and suffering and all that. Half a second. I'll check something. I just want to check something really quickly. Okay. Okay. I can only kind of blaze through the rest of it. The City of God, or De Civitate Dei. That's a response to a pagan author saying that the reason Rome was sacked was because Christianity, the gods were angry, so they let Rome be sacked. And so St. Augustine has to respond to this. And he comes up with a whole big theory of the city of God and the city of man, but basically the spiritual city of God and the city of this world, which is basically secular power. Basically earthly power, I shouldn't say secular. So he responds at first, where were the gods when a whole bunch of disasters happened to Rome before, during Livy? But then he goes on to critique the whole idea of the empire itself. He argues that the history of Rome, and now this bit I'm quoting from is quoted in The Fall of the Roman Empire by Peter Heather. And he says, this lust for domination brings great evils to vex and exhaust the whole human race. Rome was conquered by this lust when she triumphed over the conquest of Alba, Rome's first victory, and to the popular acclaim of her crime she gave the name of glory. And to put that into context, a lot of people were saying, hey, so because Christianity started under the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire must be chosen by God. And St. Augustine is much more skeptical on that point. And half a moment. I'm right back. Pardon me. The other thing I want to say very quickly with regard to St. Augustine is that he was involved in a couple of theological controversies. The Donatists split off because they didn't want to forgive some Christians during the persecutions under Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century. And the very beginning of the 4th, under pressure, they gave up the holy books, the scriptures, to be burnt. And so the question arose how to handle these people. Should we forgive them and let them back in, or should we just exclude them completely? The church decided to let them back and forgive them. This is a very simplified version of what happened. And a lot of this stuff is from memory, but I'm fairly sure my memory is accurate here. So the Donatists, why are you doing that, you stupid thing? Sorry. The Donatists said, no, we shouldn't forgive them or bring them back in. And they split off because of this. Because they didn't want to be in communion with the people who had been backsliders during the persecutions. That's how it started, and eventually, you know how it is. Once a group splits off, it tends to stay. There's an inertia where it continues in existence, and Donatists continued to be popular in North Africa, even when the occasion why they'd split off in the first place was no longer perhaps as relevant. So St. Augustine writes works against them and against the Pelagians, and this is where we get his emphasis on grace over free will, and eventually he starts talking about predestination, and that the Pelagians emphasized free will over grace, speaking crudely. Interestingly, the Pope didn't want to condemn the Pelagians, so St. Augustine had to have recourse to the secular power, to the imperial authorities. But that's all by the way. Well, no, it's not by the way, but it's not. It doesn't affect his transcendent importance. So, quick word about De Doctrina Christiana. Christian education supports moderate use of pagan learning and the study of rhetoric, so that they'll have the tools wherewith to combat paganism. So that's him. And in half a moment, I will come back and I will say a little something about why Rome fell. And then I may say a little about the early Middle Ages. I might say something at least about Boethius and then move on. Then put the rest off till next time, where I would do the Latin Middle Ages, and hopefully, and also we can do the Celts, the Irish and Welsh, which I'm looking forward to. So, half a moment, I'm right back. Pardon. Oh, heavens. Oh, dear. Have a moment. Okay. Fall of Rome. My main source for that is The Fall of the Roman Empire by Peter Heather. Where he argues essentially that the limitations of the Roman state made it unable to withstand the incursions of large numbers of unassimilated and barbarians in their territory. The barbarians moved into Rome initially. Partly they want to enjoy the benefits of Roman civilization, but partly they were running away from the Hun. And Roman wealth, incidentally. Rome was very wealthy, much wealthier than they were, and partly to get away from the Huns, they were driven there by the Huns. So eventually Rome, and the kind of the coup de grace was the Vandal conquest of North Africa, because North Africa was like the breadbasket of Rome. We're speaking mainly of Tunisia here, what is now Tunisia. It was the breadbasket of Rome. So once the Vandals conquered that, the Romans didn't have that as a supply they didn't have the benefit of the taxes and the foodstuffs from North Africa, and on top of that, from large areas where the barbarians had occupied in Gaul and in Spain, they didn't have the tax revenues from there either, so they weren't able to. So they couldn't afford a proper defense, and eventually, when they weren't able to get Africa back, that pretty much spelt North Africa back. That essentially spelt doom for the Roman Empire in the West. Pardon me. So, what is the result of this for education and therefore for literature? Well, let's see. And I'm quoting from Heather here. The 3rd century. Okay, let's see. And what does he say? Too much of the life in the provinces was dependent upon the political and cultural order of the state for its passing to go unnoticed. Take education, for instance. The literary education characteristic of the late Roman elites, Rome, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, was not cheaply bought. It required the best part of a decade's intensive instruction with the grammarian that only the landowning class could afford to devote so much time to their children's education. Oh, shut up. Sorry. Speaking classical Latin or Greek instantly marked one as civilized. So, the vast majority of the new bureaucrats came from the elites for whom a classical education continued to be de rigueur. But in the post-Roman West, elite career patterns changed. Because now military service for the king rather than a foot on the bureaucratic ladder was the main path to advancement for the secular elites. So no one really bothered anymore with a full Latin education. Some of them of Roman descent did teach their children to read and write, but their aims were more limited. As a result, by about the 7th century, writing was confined to clerics, while secular elites tended to be content just to read, and they no longer saw writing as an essential part of their identity. So that is why in the early Middle Ages, and to some extent in the later Middle Ages, the educated elite were almost entirely of the clergy. So that is that. Let me see. And with that, seems a pretty good stopping place. I'll get started on the Middle Ages in our next lecture, when we'll cover early medieval Latin and Irish and Welsh. So that means, we'll have to say a little something about the Middle Ages, their inventions, and I actually haven't put that in the presentation yet anyway. So that's doubly a reason why to put off till next time. So that will do for now. Rome has fallen. What will happen next? We'll find out in our next installment. So thank you for watching and listening, and have a riot.